Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Chris Bechtel, and I will be your host today. Today's webinar is the fifth in the series of collaborative innovation presented by Innovation Brief in partnership with Innovation Enterprise. We'd like to thank RocketSpace for sponsoring the webinar series and helping us to make this happen. If you have not heard of RocketSpace, they are helping some of the largest corporations around the world expand their innovation pipeline through startup partnerships and collaborative industry accelerator programs. For registrants of this webinar series, RocketSpace will provide a free copy of their disruption report that includes the top trends of 2017 and startups within the following tech themes: communication, customer experience, connectivity, IoT, and mobility and transportation. Thanks again to RocketSpace. We are pleased to have a great webinar today. A couple of quick housekeeping notes for those of you that are joining us. You'll see on the left side of your screen, you have the ability to chat to us as presenters, in which you'll be able to ask us questions. We will have about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar today for you to ask questions of our featured speaker today, Greg. So feel free to type questions as we proceed. I'll be collecting them and holding as many as we can to get to as we get to our Q&A session. Also, if you have any issues with audio, sometimes it's better to dial in by phone. You can do so by navigating to the upper right corner of your webinar window and choosing the More button. It'll be under 3 dots and switching to phone, and you'll be able to dial in by phone. Also, there are a couple of icons in the upper left: thumbs up, thumbs down, reaction. So please, feel free to give us some feedback as you go. If there are any questions you have or answers, feel free to comment there. So moving along, we've got a great agenda today. I'd also encourage all of you, we have one last webinar coming up in a couple of weeks, so be on the lookout for invites to that. Today's speaker, Greg Satell, is a popular writer, speaker, and innovation advisor whose work has appeared in Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fast Company, Inc., and other A-list publications. Greg helps organizations grow by identifying the right strategies for the right problems and overcome disruptive threats to their business and their industry. He applies rigorous frameworks, identifies strategic resources, and works with enterprises to build an innovation playbook, the subject of our webinar today, to tackle the challenges of the future. You can find Greg's blog at digitaltonto.com and on Twitter at digitaltonto. His first book, Mapping Innovation, a Playbook for Navigating a Disruptive Age, will be published by McGraw-Hill this month. We will be sharing with you at the end of the webinar a free chapter of the book, so be on the lookout for that, as well as the book is available Amazon today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Greg. Thanks for joining us, Greg.
Thanks for having me, Chris, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar. The purpose of the webinar today is to provide you with some tools to develop your own innovation playbook and prepare for the future. I'd like to start with a question. How long do you think it takes to go from initial discovery to an actual measurable impact on society? And if you could just type your answer into the little message box there. So I have one depends. Somebody says about a year. One person says 20 years. So a pretty wide-ranging set of answers. Somebody says 2 to 3 years. What if I were to tell you it takes on average about 30 years to go from initial discovery to an actual measurable impact? When I tell most people that, they get discouraged. They say, well, what's the point in that? I mean, 30 years. I could be dead in 30 years. What's the use? But that's looking at it exactly backwards. What it really means is that the next big thing is usually about 29 years old. Just most people haven't noticed it yet. Or as William Gibson put it, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. So there's enormous opportunity out there that we just haven't picked up. Now that's not how we're usually encouraged to think about innovation. We usually get the action hero version, where some incredible person has this moment of epiphany and goes straight out and changes the world. But that's not how it really works. To give you a sense of what I mean, let's think about the story of Alexander Fleming, who was a brilliant but sometimes careless pathologist who in 1928 came back from his summer vacation to find that a mysterious mold had contaminated his petri dishes and was eradicating the bacteria colonies he'd been growing. A lot of people would have just thrown the work out and started over, but he decided to study the mold instead. And that's how Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. And that's usually where the story ends. But if we look a little bit deeper, we'll see that there's actually a lot more to it than that. For example, penicillin wasn't made commercially available until 1945, almost 20 years later. So what took so long? And if we do a little bit more checking, we'll find that what Alexander Fleming discovered really couldn't have cured anybody. It was just a secretion from a particular mold that could kill bacteria in a petri dish. You couldn't store it, you couldn't inject it, you couldn't make enough of it to be therapeutically effective, and nobody had any idea whether it was safe or not, or whether it would be effective in a human body. So when he published his paper, nobody really noticed. And it just became another paper in a scientific journal, like the thousands of other papers that were published that year. And it took about 10 years before a completely different team, led by a guy named Howard Florey and another guy, Ernst Chain, who rediscovered his paper and thought it had potential. And because they had a much larger and more diverse team, they were able to make some progress. They were able to transform that mold secretion into a storable powder. They were able to develop a fermentation process because they had technicians. They were able to run initial trials on mice, and it became clear that penicillin had incredible potential. But they still had problems. They still couldn't make enough of it to be effective in humans. As a matter of fact, the first guy they tried to treat with penicillin ended up dying simply because they ran out of it and they couldn't make enough of it to continue treating him. So they ended up leaving England to go work with labs in the United States. And working with those labs, they were able to identify a more potent version of the bacteria, of the mold, develop a new fermentation process, identify new fermentation medium, which was common in the American Midwest at the time, but nobody in England had ever heard of it before. And then finally, the US government, through the War Board, basically ordered 24 pharmaceutical companies start manufacturing stuff, which is a great go-to market strategy if you can get it, but it's not usually available. So that's how penicillin eventually became used at the end of World War II, and then after the war was over, became commercially available. And even then, there was a lot of doctors who didn't want to use it because it wasn't like they hadn't been treating infections before. They had, and they had seen some people get better. It wasn't very effective, but they were comfortable with it and were a little bit suspicious of some supposed new miracle cure. So what we initially see what we initially hear as one guy with with one idea actually ends up being a 20-year process with involving hundreds, if not thousands, of people along with the federal government. So it takes a lot more than just an idea. A lot of people say, well, that was a long time ago. Today, we have true superheroes, people like Steve Jobs, who came out with the Macintosh. But again, if we look, we'd see, if we check into it, we'll see that the technology in the Macintosh was actually developed back in 1968 with Douglas Engelbart and the mother of all demos, and then was developed further and made operational at Xerox throughout the 70s. Doesn't mean Steve Jobs didn't do anything. He did. He recognized the potential of it with which Xerox really didn't. In fact, the executives there looked at a personal computer and said, that really looks like something for secretaries, not for big shot executives like us. So Steve Jobs saw that this could be a product for consumers, and the Macintosh, although initial sales were slow, ended up doing quite well. But even then, the world didn't change because you couldn't do much with the Macintosh. You could play video games with it. You could write some papers, but it really took until the late 90s, or about 30 years, for personal computers to really make an impact, because a personal computer can't really do much on its own. You needed complementary innovations like the internet and productivity software and other applications. So that's why we often miss emerging technologies that will be disruptive, because initially they don't really look like much. And also stories like these, they can be a little bit misleading because we know how they end. So it's easy for us to say, oh, of course, I would have seen that penicillin would be a miracle drug, or personal computers would unleash a productivity boom. So I just want to show you one more example that's a bit more recent. This is Charlie Bennett. And Charlie is incredibly smart. In fact, he's so smart that when you mention his name to a lot of other very, very smart people, their eyes just glaze over, because Charlie is truly in a class by himself. And when he was growing up in the 1950s, he was inspired by Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA. So he ended up getting a degree in biochemistry, and then went to Harvard for his graduate work. And he actually got the chance to be James Watson's teaching assistant. So he spent most of his Tony, could you check? Somebody says that the slides aren't progressing. So if you could check on that. So he spent most of his time with teaching undergraduates how long strands of RNA migrate out of the nucleus of the cell, and they meet up with ribosomes and release amino acids and make proteins. It's the type of stuff that high school students learn. That high school students learn today, but back then was cutting edge science. Then one semester, Charlie decided to take an elective course on the theory of computing. And he was introduced to this idea of the Turing machine. Long strings of code that go through a single reader and produce universal computation. So, and he thought to himself, that seems a lot like what I've been teaching in Watson's class. And he just thought that was the coolest thing ever, that DNA could be some kind of computer, and that nature all by its own could produce computation. So instead of being a geneticist, he went to work for IBM, and he did some early work and stuff like reversible computing and other things. But his big breakthrough came in 1993, when he helped lead the quantum teleportation experiment. And that was important for two reasons. First, it helped disprove one of Einstein's last theories. But even more importantly, it led Charlie a few months later to write down his 4 rules of quantum information. Now, I know that seems terribly abstract, and it is, because that's what innovation looks like. The next big thing always starts looking like nothing at all. That's why we miss it. That's why technologies get to be disruptive, because most people don't notice them. If they were obvious, we wouldn't be disrupted by them. So I want to take you and show you a little closer look of Charlie's idea. This is a scientist at IBM, and he's sitting there working on a tablet, which is, of course, hundreds of times more powerful than the initial Macintosh. And because of a process, because of Moore's law, which means that we basically double the number of transistors on a silicon wafer every 18 months or so. And that's what's really driven the digital revolution. But that's not what makes this picture special. What makes this picture special is what that tablet is connected to, which is a quantum computer based on Charlie's ideas that has a potential to be millions of times more powerful than today's technology. So how's that going to affect your business? Well, let's think about it. For starters, it's going to make virtually all present encryption technology obsolete. So if your business involves any transactions, like selling things to customers or paying suppliers, it's going to have a pretty big effect. And that's just for starters. Current applications being explored are managing large and complex financial portfolios, and modeling proteins for medical research, and artificial intelligence. But we've really just started to scratch the surface, because honestly, these things don't work that well. These things don't work very well yet. They're still really 5 to 10 years off. So let's look at quantum computing in the context of the Gartner hype cycle. If we look, we can see it there sandwiched between like 20 other things. And like all those things, quantum computing is going to get hyped up to the peak of expectations, inflated expectations, then come crashing down to the trough of disillusionment, and then start creeping up the slope of enlightenment till it finally reaches the plateau of productivity and becomes transformational. So that's a really big problem, because quantum computing's complicated enough. How are we supposed to keep track of that and all those other things, plus a bunch of stuff that isn't even on, that Gartner doesn't even track, because Gartner really focuses only on information technology. Doesn't really track things like genomics and nanotechnology that are also going to make an impact. So how are we going to keep up with all this stuff and still focus on what we need to do to run our business, like solve customer problems and improve processes and make profits and do all those things? The obvious answer is that we can't, and we shouldn't even try. But what we can do is we can search for problems to solve. We can seek out unresolved problems in the marketplace, with our customers, within our organizations. And if we do that, if we use that as a lens, then all of this emerging technology becomes not just a source of disruption, but an incredible source, a source of incredible possibility and opportunity. And in my research, that's really what I found that great innovators do differently. They're not any smarter or any faster or have a better vision. More than anything else, it's that they have a systematic and disciplined process of continually seeking out new problems. So that's why I wrote my book, because we need to go beyond strategic planning and start learning how to do innovation planning. Innovation planning is strategic planning is based on stuff we know or think we know, and we're trying to predict. But we also need to plan for areas we need to explore and things we need to prepare for. Sorry, software stuck for a second there. And that's basically what my book, Mapping Innovation, is all about. So I want to take you through a set of tools that will help you build your innovation playbook and prepare for the future. So the first step is to identify problems, disruptions, and opportunities. As a case study, I'd like to focus on the agribusiness for no other reason than it it seems like an interesting case study because nobody ever thinks farming could be a source of big innovation. I mean, you plant in the spring, reap in the fall. But as we'll see, there's actually a lot going on, even in a seemingly simple business like agriculture. So once we identify problems, disruptions, and opportunities, we can start mapping innovation priorities out. So in the short term, things that are happening right now, we have big data and Internet of Things. And those are things that are actually increasing yields right now. So if you're in the agriculture business, either you've started to do this, or if you haven't, you really need to start right now. And if you have started, you really need to improve because this is still pretty new with agriculture. So that's an immediate set of problems you need to solve. If you look a little bit further out, you can see that there's some big opportunities like vertical farming. These are a new technology of farms that exist inside cities in buildings, and they have the potential to bring agriculture much closer to the customers, so they get much fresher food. They also cut down on transportation costs and fuel costs. So that could be a big potential opportunity in the years to come. Another is the whole idea of genomic products. So using agriculture not just to grow food, but to grow crops that produce chemicals and even petroleum products. Another thing that we might want to look into if we're in the agriculture business is the fact that we're going to have a skills shortage because we're going to have to start really recruiting people with skills that we never had to recruit before. People like data scientists and software developers. So we're gonna have to figure out how to do that. And finally, in the long term, we're gonna probably have to do something about climate change, and try and figure out how that's going to affect our business and what we're going to do about it. So once we've identified the innovation priorities, we want to classify those problems in some way so that we can match those problems to strategies that will be effective for solving them. And the first lens we're going to use is this 3 horizons model, because some of these innovation priorities, they apply to existing markets and existing capabilities, and some of them apply to adjacent markets and or adjacent capabilities, and some of them apply to new markets and or new capabilities. So we want to know that before we start thinking about our approach, because that's going to really change how we want to go about things. Another filter we want to use is an operational checklist. Can we define a technical specification? In some cases, it's pretty easy. Example I really like is Steve Jobs and the iPod, which he defined as 1,000 songs in my pocket. Well, that basically serves as a technical specification, because you know you need a hard drive of a certain capacity and a certain size and weight. And once he was able to find that, it took him a couple of years. Once he was able to find that, he knew he could make his iPod. But in other cases, it's really hard to clearly define a technical specification, and that's going to really change our innovation strategy. We also want to look at whether we can define a job description. For some of these problems, we're going to already have job descriptions that apply, and in some cases we don't. And again, that's going to change how we need to approach things. So after we've classified the problems and we know a lot more about them, we're finally ready to map the innovation space. And we do that by asking two basic questions. How well is the problem defined, and how well is the skills domain defined? And we should be able to answer those questions pretty easily, because we've just gone through two filters to help us classify the problems. And then everything breaks out nicely, and we can plot it on this innovation matrix into four quadrants: breakthrough innovation, sustaining innovation, basic research, and disruptive innovation. And that can help us define a general approach. So in the upper right-hand quadrant, where we have sustaining innovation, that's pretty close to traditional product development. We mainly need to execute, and that means we need to devote resources and manage process. But often one of those elements is hard to define, either the problem or the domain. And in that case, traditional strategies won't work. When we have, as in the upper left-hand quadrant, where we have breakthrough innovation, those are well-defined problems that we can't seem to find a solution for. So in that case, we want to iterate the solution spaces. I heard a great story about this from one of the technology companies. So apparently they had won a contract to design a sensor that could detect pollutants in small concentrations underwater. So they put together their crack chip designers, and they started batting around ideas for about 45 minutes until the marine biologist who was assigned to their team walked in with a bag of clams, dropped the bag of clams on the table. They all gave him looked up, gave him these surprised looks, and he started to explain. You see, these clams, they can detect pollutants at just a few parts per million. And when that happens, they open their shells. So we don't really need any super sophisticated chip that detects pollutants. We just need a really simple and cheap one that can detect when the clams open their shells. So they saved $1 million and apparently ate the clams for dinner. So, and that happens quite a lot. Often we find when a problem seems unsolvable, input from some adjacent field can make a big difference. For example, sometimes on the InnoSet platform, they find when there's a chemistry problem that the chemist can't solve, a biologist or a physicist will come in and say, oh, we've been doing that stuff for years. On the other hand, sometimes we have a pretty good solution, but we can't really define what the problem is. And that's more common than you'd think. That's, for instance, why Yahoo didn't buy Google when they had the chance to buy Google for $5 million, because they said, well, it seems like a great search engine, but we don't see how it solves a problem. We're trying to keep people on our site, not help them find things so they can get off more quickly. And you can build a great business using a fairly standard solution, but applying it to a new problem. And that's certainly been true with companies like Uber and Airbnb, which use fairly standard technology, but then went and identified completely new problems to solve. Couldn't change the slide there. I know some of you have trouble with the slide changes, so I hope that's getting cleared up. And the last quadrant is basic research, and that's really about exploration, where we want to probe new spaces and build new connections. And that's probably the most underutilized quadrant, and I'll get to why in just a second. But now that we've defined a sort of general approach, we want to filter that down to a more specific strategy. And here we can see that there's actually quite a few strategic options in each quadrant. So for sustaining innovation, things like strategic road mapping or traditional R&D labs, or even an acquisition strategy can work well if you have both a well-defined problem and well-defined domains. Also, design thinking works very well with these types of problems. For breakthrough innovation, we want to apply more open innovation strategies, so we're able to bring in more skills domains. Because when we get stuck on a problem, it usually means that we haven't defined that skills domain correctly, or that we need to bring a new one in. For disruptive innovation, which is essentially solutions looking for problems, we also have a number of strategies. The VC model, innovation labs work well with these types of problems. The 15 or 20% rule, depending on whether you're using the 3M version or the Google version, is very good at identifying these types of problems. And probably the most effective strategy is Lean Launchpad or Lean Startup methodology, it's sometimes called, which was developed mainly by Steve Blank and Alex Osterwalder. But it's this last quadrant, the lower left quadrant, that I find is most underutilized, mainly because people think to do it, you really need to be a billion-dollar company with some kind of huge research budget. But that's not actually true. You can approach it that way, and many companies do, with research divisions or large academic partnerships. But you can also explore early stage technologies and things like consortia, like the manufacturing hubs, or things like the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research at Argonne National Laboratory. The national labs themselves can be a great resource. Journals and conferences, a lot of the VCs who focus on early stage technologies, that's what they told me they do. They said they read the journals and they go to the conferences and they network, and they're able to identify promising technologies that way. Another super underutilized source is local universities. And almost everybody has a local university with some department that applies to their business in the area. But you really have to get out and engage them. And that is what I found that really makes the difference. Scientists, like everybody else, want their work to have an impact, but there's no industry hotline they can call every time they have an idea or insight. So if you want to benefit from research going on, what you really have to do, much more than spending a lot of money or investing some kind of huge research budget, is to get out and engage and be interested in the fields that might affect your business. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is leverage platforms to access ecosystems of talent, technology, and information. This is becoming more and more important because digital technology allows us to connect to so much. If we're only focusing on the resources within our companies, we're not going to be able to compete effectively. So in the case of the agribusiness, you can see there's lots of platforms that they can leverage for each of the innovation opportunities. Obviously, more for the short-term priorities like big data and Internet of Things, but even for the second and third horizon opportunities. There's things like the MIT Open Agriculture Initiative for vertical farming, or the CRISPR Congress for genomic products, data.gov for climate change. So it's really important to get out and start identifying which open platforms you can leverage. We also need at some point to transform business models, because no business model lasts forever. And a lot of people, when they think about innovation, they're only thinking about, product or service or process innovation. But transforming business models is just as important. And the best way to start doing that is actually define what your present business model is in terms of creating, delivering, and capturing value. So in the case of the agribusiness, it creates value by growing and distributing agriculture products, delivers value through logistics operations and distributors, and captures value through gross margins. But we can see that genomics technology might allow them to switch that business model. They can create value by creating not just agriculture products, but chemical products. But there's a problem there, because it also will change how they need to deliver value. Instead of delivering value through food distributors and food processors, now they need to deliver that value through manufacturers and chemical manufacturers. And that's a completely different market. So if this is something that our agriculture business is serious about, we want to start exploring that beforehand, certainly before we make any big investments. And then we can refine our business model further through the value proposition canvas and the business model canvas. I'm not going to go into any detail here. It's definitely beyond the scope of this webinar, but if you're not familiar with them, I really encourage you to learn more about them. They're pretty straightforward and incredibly useful. It's almost impossible to get funded these days in Silicon Valley without a business model canvas. So finally, we want to start pulling all these disparate strands together and actually designing an innovation playbook. And the first thing we want to do is pull from all over the innovation ecosystem. So not just our own internal resources, but also from vendors, from customers, from partners, and from the open platforms we just discussed. And the resource worksheet is a tool that helps you actually make this concrete and actionable. So for each of those channels, internal, customer, vendor, partner, and open resources, you want to set out how you're going to access technology, talent, and information you need to make an innovation work. So, for instance, with big data or Internet of Things, an agriculture business would have some internal resources like human resources and human resource department, and maybe some internal sensor data if they've already started with an Internet of Things effort. But they'd also want to tap some vendors like Amazon Web Service, Azure, Bluemix. They also might want to find a good vendor for developer training so that they can develop internal staff. They're probably going to need to contract with somebody for geospatial data, and also use open resources like Hadoop and Spark and data.gov and the US Department of Agriculture. Now, vertical farming, which is more of a second horizon innovation opportunity, is going to look a whole lot more empty. because there's not nearly as much going on yet. But still, there's quite a few resources we can map. An agribusiness would have agronomists who know a lot about agriculture, so that's an important resource. They'd probably have to go to the customer, to customers for marketing data to be able to select, for instance, which cities might be good markets. They could also partner with some venture capital firms to help locate startups that are active and might have developed some good technology. And as I mentioned before, the MIT Open Agriculture Initiative is a resource. So second horizon opportunities like vertical farming are a couple of years off, but there's already some stuff that we can start exploring now. And then the last step is to pull all of this into an innovation playbook that will consolidate all of the resource worksheets and the prior work we've done. So in Horizon 1, there's some capabilities that a agriculture business can develop. In Horizon 2, there's some new business models with chemical alternatives and new markets that they can start exploring. Also, some organizational structures they might want to think about, like developer training, maybe what it would take to develop an industrial sales team, what the salaries are like, where you pull the talent from. And then in Horizon 3, learning more about climate science and sustainable agriculture. So we've gone through really fast. We've gone through really fast. I've just sort of squeezed an entire full day workshop into about 30 minutes. But I just want to leave you with some 3 final takeaways that will hopefully crystallize everything. The first is, it's more important to prepare than adapt. Once you start adapting, almost by definition, you're already losing. So you want to start thinking about problems now, unresolved problems in the marketplace that you might be able to solve, and start preparing as early as possible. You don't really need to be that fast or that smart as long as you're early. The second thing is, we want to be explorers, not oracles. Technology is notoriously hard to predict. In any field, you'll find a lot of really smart people who are making a lot of big bets. And it's almost impossible to figure out how things are exactly going to pan out. So we don't want to get in the business of betting on one particular technology or another. But what we do want to do is start exploring possibilities and opportunities that might benefit our business. And finally, most people, when they think of innovation, they think it's all about ideas, but it really isn't. The truth is, nobody cares about your ideas. They care about how you can solve their problems. So the truth is, you don't really need a great idea. What you need to do is go out and find a good problem. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn things over to Chris right now, and I think we'll also have some Q&A.
Terrific, Greg. And thanks to everyone for attending today. Before we dive into the Q&A, a couple of quick things. I want to encourage all of you, as I mentioned before, to get Greg's book, because much of this in much more great detail is in the book. I'm going to drop a couple of links here into chat so that you can get some more information. First up here is the first chapter. So I'll drop this. We'll of course send this to you all in the follow-up email that we'll send along with the recorded version and the full PDF of this presentation. But in addition, in the meantime, I encourage all of you to take a look at Greg's book. Feel free to read this first chapter. You can also get it right now at Amazon in hardcover or on Kindle. So I'd encourage all of you to do so. So here's a link to that in the chat. So definitely do check that out. Also, do feel free to submit your questions. This is a new version of the AnyMeeting platform, hence why maybe some of you with some browser issues maybe had a couple of little hiccups there. So again, if you missed anything, we've recorded the entire presentation. We'll be sending you a link to that. But there is a little questions icon, and I see a number of you have submitted some questions, so that's great. A couple of questions.
Chris?
One thing, I guess, a question Chris? About the book, Greg, real quick, is I'm guessing is the book available in Canada as well? I'm assuming
I think so. I know it's, I think so.
Yeah.
I can't really check because I'm not in Canada, but I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure Amazon.com is North America, and and I know it's available on Amazon.co.uk. So our friends in the UK can get it as well.
Gotcha. And again, everyone, we will send it to you via email. So if you can't see the chat, if you dialed in by phone or some other means, again, we'll be sending you the links to the book and the free chapter via email that you registered for. So now let's dive into some questions. Yeah, Tony, you with us?
Yeah. So yes, I am. And I was actually hoping we could go back, and I'm going to try to go back to the innovation Playbook slide.
Yeah, this is a question about the difference between experimenting and exploring.
Well, actually, maybe we can do that in a second. But let me first formulate, because I love. I mean, the trajectory you took this through was fantastic. The idea of taking things that are sort of already visible, technologies, and then figuring out, like where do they fit for you, and the different instruments. But what I guess once we got to this point, then I wasn't quite clear on, okay, I'm that agriculture company that you're using the case study on. What sorts of things is this telling me that then I should be off and going and doing? So like what did that agriculture company do as a result of having worked through to this point?
Well, there's two levels, right? This is really just a summary of what comes out in the innovation, in the resource worksheet above. So if we go, for instance, to vertical farming. So obviously internal agronomists want to be looking at it, trying to figure out what's the difference in yields, what the difference in quality would be, all that agriculture stuff that I don't really know because I'm not an agronomist. Okay. But then they'd also want to start contacting customers about marketing data, because that's not something a typical agriculture business would have. Breakdowns by city of what the prices are, what the volume is. You'd also want to start working with venture capital people in that area and start working with the MIT Agriculture Initiative to learn how viable all this stuff is. And that would just sort of give you a start of Obviously, a second horizon opportunity is much, it's a couple of years out. So that's something that you're that's going to take some iteration.
Got it. Okay, so this is where you really start to. Oh, go ahead.
Where the innovation playbook is more at a high level. Okay, we really need to start investing in some capabilities. In terms of data science and app development and tech recruitment. So that's kind of a call to action. An industrial sales team, chemical markets, we might want to set up a working group on that might meet once a quarter or something and see if there's really, really something there. climate science and sustainable agriculture, again, that's not going to be that's a third horizon. So that's not going to be any kind of big effort. But you might want to say, hey, we should actually start, maybe sending people to a conference once a year, or figuring out what types of sustainable agriculture options might be open to us if this really becomes a problem. We should at least put it on the radar screen. So this is more of a strategy document than an actual where the resource worksheet is more of a tactical document.
Yeah, although both
that makes
of them,
sense.
I guess, and in fact, yeah, it totally makes sense. And what I'm thinking as you're discussing it is there's almost another level to this. Each of these are identifying needed actions by the organization, or there are opportunities or needed actions. And so there's another layer of, okay, here's we're creating this game plan off of it. And so this is more identifying where I surface what goes in my game plan than necessarily the game plan itself.
Right. This is more of a one-day workshop type thing. This is the start of the process. It's not the entire process. And there's also another level to it that we didn't really discuss here, but what that specific innovation strategy is. Like in the vertical farming example, that was, that's really like a breakthrough innovation. That's a pretty well-defined problem that hasn't been fully solved yet. So that's obviously an open innovation strategy. But there's going to be some more details. I mean, you can see the starts of it here. You're going to want to start working with other firms and partners who are working on the same thing, and maybe start talking to customers about it. But there's obviously a whole lot more that needs to be discussed than simply what's on this chart. This is more of like a blueprint than than some sort of super complex flow chart or something.
Okay, and then
sense?
Sorry, I cut you off earlier. Yeah, it totally makes sense, and that I for some reason I wasn't quite grokking that as we were going. But then the question, if you can go back even further, then back to the question about explore versus experiment.
Yeah, well, that's a much simpler question. So an experiment is you're actually doing something. Like if you're doing a business model process in the sort of lean startup mode, you're actually going out and you're talking to customers and you're building minimal viable products, and you might be iterating with some prototypes. Or in the case of an open innovation strategy, you're actually creating partnerships. You're going out and you're actually doing real work. Exploring isn't doing real work. You're not making any kind of material investments. You're just going to see what's out there. In the case of working with a local university, you might just build a relationship with a couple of professors, ask them to come in and present to your technical staff. Maybe do an event at the local engineering school or chemistry department. So that doesn't necessarily mean a real material investment. You're not doing anything with any kind of intensity, but you're trying to put your radar up and try to get more of an early warning system. Because let's face it, I mean, this year there's going to be tens of thousands of scientific papers published, and chances are a couple of them are going to affect your business. And you want to find that out a few years before rather than a few years after. And that just doing that can actually make a huge difference.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Actually makes, yeah, it totally makes sense. So this is great. Yeah, I really appreciate the insights on that. And it actually, one of the things I guess I'd wonder is, so certainly this would expand, for most organizations going through this exercise, it would expand the set of things that I'm going to go off and be able to go do. Is this like an annual process that you might use, or is there a cadence to doing this?
Yeah, it's more of an annual process. In my experience, if you know if you get the senior management together, you can surface a lot of things. Um, and I think most companies do. They have an annual offsite or a quarterly offsite, and they're talking about emerging uh, emerging opportunities or disruptions or problems. The problem really is that then what do you do then? How do you create a basic roadmap that you can
Yeah.
come back and refer to, and come back to once a quarter and say, are we doing anything with this? And have, especially with the second and third horizon priorities, because those are the ones that really get lost. Like in our agriculture example, I think most agricultural companies these days are aware of what's going on with Internet of Things and big data and analytics in agriculture. I mean, anywhere you look, there's articles on it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably going to stay fairly top of mind, I think, for most. But those second and third horizon opportunities, those tend to get neglected, and then they kind of creep up on you. And you say, we really knew that was going to happen 2-3 years ago, but we were busy doing other things, and we didn't really pay as much attention to it as we should. And then you get into this cycle of adapting and catching up, and that usually means you end up investing too much money on things that are probably less likely to work out than if you had started earlier. That makes sense?
Yep, that makes total sense. If we had more time, I would love to actually, even with the audience, get feedback on who participates in this and in what ways. Because when you talked about senior management team, well, part of the senior management team, I think likely would make sense, but other parts would not. And I would actually love to get feedback from others on that. But we're right at the top of the hour. And so, Greg, thanks so much. Chris, I don't know if you've got anything else in terms of wrap up here.
Yeah, so I wanted to just again thank everyone for attending today. And make sure you stay on the lookout for the email that we will be following up with you, in which you'll have the recording, the link to the presentation, along with links to buy Greg's book and read the first chapter. I also want to encourage all of you to attend our next webinar coming up on Tuesday, May 23rd. With Gordon Vala Webb. We're going to be talking about 3 keys to accelerating innovation through connecting and collaborating with those outside your organization. Lastly, I do want to encourage all of you to connect with Greg directly. You can visit him at digitaltonto.com. I'd encourage all of you to reach out if you have additional questions on anything that Greg's covered today. Obviously, he's a fantastic speaker, great general, all-around guy. So I would encourage all of you to work with them, reach out to him and connect. Any final thoughts, Greg, that you want to leave us with? That's sort of something that just sort of sums up where you'd like us to kind of go from here, and any final thoughts on where you think things are going?
I think we covered everything, except that on digitaltonto.com, there's a weekly newsletter as well, which will help you keep updated. There's 2 articles every week on the site. And feel free to reach out to me with any questions. There's a contact email on the site that you can use as well.
Terrific. Again, thanks, Greg, for a great presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, and stay tuned for our next webinar.